It's amazing because this guy has been in the Irish crime firmament for 30 years. We've been talking about him and what he did with to Veronica Guerin. Can you give us a little bit of background, allegedly, a bit of background on John Gilligan and how he got into the crime scene?
Well, John Gilligan was a small-time criminal around Dublin in the 70s, doing, jump overs, post office robberies and so on. He had worked on the boats plying between here primarily and Liverpool, and he was, if you like, introduced to a life to crime. He was from a tough background in Dublin when he was working on the BNI line. He got involved in crime in Liverpool, for instance. He was a heavy gambler. But he graduated from doing jump overs and the like to doing warehouse robberies, clearing out factories full of, say, washing machines or vacuum cleaners and flogging them around Dublin. So it wasn't very sophisticated crime, but he was very good at it. But sooner or later, the authorities caught up with him, and he was given a fairly lengthy stretch after a couple of acquittals, it must be said. And it seemed that he came out of Portlaoise prison with a changed focus. He focused entirely on the drug importation scene in the 80s, and specifically on cannabis. And he came to be the biggest drug importer of his day, specialising, if you will, in cannabis. And of course, that led to this kind of self-aggrandisement where he felt that he was untouchable, leading to the tragedy that was to be the murder of Veronica Guerin.
Yeah, we've seen that in a number of the clips and how successful as a crime boss he was when it did go to drugs. And of course, Veronica Guerin came in. She was a Sunday Independent reporter who was known to doorstep certain crime bosses. How does she come into this documentary, or how does this documentary just focus on John Gilligan?
Well, obviously, Veronica Guerin, as John Gilligan said himself, it was the reason that he was the focus of attention. I mean, this was the intersection, if you will, between politics and crime, because when Veronica Guerin was murdered, you remember, the Dáil was convulsed. There were mountains of flowers outside Leinster House. Special legislation was rushed through. We now have the Criminal Assets Bureau, one of the most effective bureaus of its kind in the world. Many other countries have modelled their legislation on that. And that all flowed from John Gilligan's criminal activities and the murder of Veronica Guerin. Put at its starkest, she went to doorstep him. He savagely assaulted her. She pressed charges. He saw that if that case went ahead, he would go to jail, and effectively his gang murdered Veronica Guerin. That's it in a nutshell. He denies it all, of course. Yeah. But as you'll see in the documentary, all his lies are completely dissected by substantial figures like former senior Gardaí like Michael O'Sullivan and Felix McKenna, who basically dissect all the claims that he makes in this series.
He is going on trial today in Spain, actually, with a gun charge there. I'm just wondering, he says in the documentary an awful lot. I never wanted this fame. I wanted to stay in the background. I didn't want any of this.
But that's old bull.
Do you believe that?
That's old bull.
Yeah.
I mean, he revelled in the notoriety. He gave interviews at the time.
Yeah.
I mean, there's a fuss about this series now. But at the time, even before he was charged, after the murder of Veronica Guerin, he was the interview to get. And in fact, one reporter travelled to Amsterdam and secured an interview with him. This was before the trial. And he was the centre of the universe at the time. And he had an enormous complex out in the outskirts of Dublin, an equestrian centre, a huge house. I mean, who believes that kind of thing, that he wanted to keep a low profile?
Yeah. But he's been out of the spotlight for a long time. Why do you think he's doing this interview?
Well, people who study people like John Gilligan, criminologists, will tell you that there's a large narcissistic element to their makeup. They want to be talked about. They want to talk about their exploits. You've heard of the expression, a criminal returning to the scene of the crime. Well, in this series, this is what John Gilligan is doing. Perhaps he knows he's facing a sentence in Spain that'll put him away for a considerable period of time. But effectively, it's just an opportunity for him to talk to himself. But I think the value in this documentary is that every claim he makes is debunked. And Jimmy Guerin, obviously, and I can understand his reservations. He's upset about the documentary, but he said one thing I'll take issue with. He said, John Gilligan is a very clever man. Well, I think if you watch these 3 documentaries, I don't think anybody will come away thinking that he is a very clever man.
Well, that's incredibly interesting because, as you mentioned, the brother of Veronica Guerin, Jimmy Guerin, he has taken issue with this documentary, as did Hildegard Naughton, Minister Hildegard Naughton, who is the Minister for the National Drugs Strategy, and saying, you know, that it's a bad idea to have this documentary out there. We've had 2 films about Veronica Guerin. We've had numerous books about this situation. There is an utter fascination with this in the country.
But
Do you think it's
glamorising potentially?
But do you think having him speak is the wrong thing to do?
Oh, I think if he was speaking in isolation, it wouldn't be defensible. But as I say, this series puts all his carry-on in context. It's dissected, it's rebutted by far more significant figures than John Gilligan, like, as I say, Felix McKenna and Michael O'Sullivan, who were both very senior Gardaí, one an assistant commissioner who had widespread dealings with John Gilligan. I can understand why Jimmy Guerin feels upset. I mean, he's to be commended for keeping the flame of his sister's reputation alive. And I can understand, too, why Hildegard Naughton feels she has to kind of follow suit. But, I mean, there's been plenty of other documentaries. There was a documentary, as the producer of this documentary said yesterday, there was a highly successful series about Rose Dugdale quite recently. And, of course, there was 2 books and a podcast series about Malcolm MacArthur, a remorseless killer who's never shown any kind of contrition.
We spoke about it here, the Gubu case.
Indeed. So I think, you know, as long as people's exploits or claims or what have you are put in context, I think this is an absolutely worthwhile exercise. But it's certainly not glorification, and it's not even warts and all.
Yeah. Can I ask you what it was like, I'm sorry, Tommy, to be a journalist at the time this happened? You knew Veronica Guerin. It was, I don't think anyone had expected something like this to happen. You know, we had the murder of Garda Jerry McCabe, which was just shocking. And then this happened. Was it an incredibly frightening time?
Well, look, it came completely out of the blue. Nobody thought that somebody would go so far as to murder a high-profile investigative journalist. It was pretty shattering, and she was a sociable person and very well known, as you suggest. So it really, you know, caused an absolute earthquake in the journalistic scene in this country, because she was well known, popular, you know, hardworking, certainly, took risks, undoubtedly. But what was striking was the response of the state, because it seemed to me at the time that John Gilligan and his gang had certainly bitten off more than they could chew. The state responded with all the legislation that we mentioned earlier. Yeah. And essentially, you know, the gang was rolled up. One was convicted of the murder of Veronica Guerin. John Gilligan escaped conviction by the skin of his teeth because the judge simply didn't find a protected witness credible. But, you know, there were many raised eyebrows about John Gilligan's involvement. So, you know, the state kind of manned up in a way after this.
Yeah. It is a fascinating story, and it will be fascinating tonight. And even, as you say, from this cab to being formed and everything else is really incredible. And I'd say one of the many incredible stories that you covered in your career. I mean, think of the Good Friday Agreement as well. But listen, thank you so much for joining us this morning, David Davin-Power.
Thank you, David.
Great to have you with us.